from north and south to the beautiful land. Welcome to an almost endless war between the king of the north and the king of the south. Yes, the Bible is realistic and does not sweeten life in this world with visions of birds flying peacefully through the skies, but depicts the fights of wild beasts. And it's a good thing, because otherwise we couldn't understand the reason for so much evil, for so much confrontation between peoples and nations. We need to know that God does not ignore all this, and that despite the horrendous record of history, He continues to lead events as the arbiter of all destinies to complete His plan to save His people. I have heard many to say that chapter 11 of Daniel is the most difficult to interpret of his book. However, when you read the doctoral dissertations of many authors, Seventh-day Adventists and not Seventh-day Adventists, whatever topic you choose to research, you begin by bringing together all the different opinions and soon conclude that what you are going to study is the hardest thing to understand. This is the way scholars justify the purpose and importance of their research. In my view, it is not that every subject being investigated is the most difficult to understand, but that the Bible is not studied as it should be under the principle of allowing it to interpret itself. Therefore, if we are to hear every wind of doctrine, we will help to build the great Babylon. The problem is rather that God made man upright, but they have sought out many devices. Ecclesiastes 7 verse 29. The more we know the Bible and history, the easier the understanding of the prophetic passages becomes. In order to locate ourselves in the time corresponding to the descriptions of Daniel 11, it is preferable to look for the expressions and descriptions that were anticipated in the previous visions. Thus, we will avoid getting lost in the most detailed description of all Daniel's visions. So, after a quick glance at the first part of Daniel 11, we'll put more interest in the second half that corresponds to our time, where the world's penultimate battle is fought. The vision starts with the struggles for power between the Persians and the Greeks. Let us make a comparative synthesis of the chapter with other visions. First, Alexander the Great is succeeded by his 4 generals, Daniel 11 verses 3 and 4, and you see an equivalence in chapter 8 verses 5 and 8, and verse 21. Second point, pagan Rome invades the glorious land, Daniel 11:16, and the causal text is chapter 8 verse 9. 3. Taxes of Emperor Caesar Augustus, Daniel 11:20. We find the story of Luke 2 verses 1 and 2. First census. Fourth point, the Messiah, Prince of the Covenant, is broken. The crucifixion of Jesus. We find this in verse 22 of Daniel 11. And the former text is 9, verses 25 to 27, and the story is found in Matthew 27, verses 33 to 50. The fifth point, the papacy. It is not as the former and as the latter, Daniel 11:29, according to Young's literal translation. This statement hints at change in the Roman system of government, with the introduction of the papacy, because from then on a more religious activity is seen in the king of the north. It infuriates against the Holy Covenant and favors those who abandon that covenant, verse 30. It desecrates the sanctuary and removes the continuous intercession of Christ, the heavenly priest, Daniel 11:31. And the former passage is Daniel 8, verses 11 to 13, that we consider in a former subject, and Daniel 12:11, and in Hebrew 8, verses 1 and 2 in the New Testament. It establishes the abomination of desolation in the temple of God, Daniel 11:31. The former text is Daniel 8:13, and the last text is 12, verse 11, 2 Thessalonians 2:4, Revelation 13:5-7, and Revelation 17:5. If Daniel 8:13 uses rebellion of desolation instead of abomination of desolation, it is because the final scope is in that chapter, the purification of the sanctuary, Daniel 8:14. As a matter of fact, the sins of rebellion were forgiven and the sanctuary was cleansed from those confessed rebellions. The medieval sin of those who follow unearthly counterfeit authority, 2 Thessalonians 2:3, is curable by the blood of the Lamb, Daniel 8:14. Thus, we can see implicitly that the purification of the sanctuary has to do only with the sins of God's people, not with the sins of foreign invading nations. Leviticus 16:30 is addressed to Israel, not to the Canaanites or any pagan empire. The Lord said, "For on this day you will be cleansed from all your sins." There is also a description of the medieval persecution in Daniel 11, verse 35, that was also mentioned in chapter 7, verse 25, chapter 8, verses 10 and 13, and that is revealed again in Revelation 13, verse 7 and 17:6 in the New Testament. Purification by persecution has to do with the custom of passing gold through fire so that the scum that covered it was burned, Daniel 11:35 and 12:10. And we find something equivalent in Revelation 13, verse 18. The fire of persecution has this effect on the formation of the character of a Christian, so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless. Whiteness refers to the washing of clothing by the blood of the Lamb, Revelation 3, verses 4 and 5, and verse 18, Revelation 7:14, and Revelation 22, verse 14. Until the time of the end, for it will still come at the appointed time, namely 1260 years leading to the time of the end. Daniel 11:35, that is also quoted or mentioned in Daniel 7:25 and chapter 12, verses 7 to 10. In the New Testament, we read this in Revelation 11:2 and in chapter 12, verse 6:14 and 13:5. He exalts himself and aggrandizes over God. Blasphemy. Daniel 11:36. We find this in 7, verse 8 and 25, in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 4, in Revelation 13, verses 5 to 7 and 17:4. Indifference to the true God and celibacy. Indifference to the love of women, Daniel 11:37. By using blasphemous titles, the Pope shows his carelessness for the honor and judgment of God. He will seek to honor a God that is different from the God revealed in the Bible with gold and precious stones, Daniel 11:38. And we find a description of these precious golden stones in Revelation 18, verse 4 and chapter 17 also. You may call any god by the same name, like the Israelites who referred to God in their apostasy, mixing the terms given by God with the names of other pagan gods. For example, in the book of Hosea, we see that in the worst apostasy of Israel, the people used indistinctly the name Yahweh, the Eternal, and Baal, Lord, thinking that it was the same. Honor the kings who recognize him and distribute the earth at his pleasure, Daniel 11:39. It was the Pope who laid the crown of the heads of kings and emperors. He evicted the Cathar princes from the lands that were being coveted by different kingdoms in southern Gaul and gave them to the King of France. He granted Spain the lands of America in the Bull of Inter Caetera and confirmed a Portuguese dominance that other popes had granted them before over Africa, Guinea, and the gold mine. The war between the king of the north and the south in the time of the end, Daniel 11:4 to 45, is the most important subject for us today. Beginning with Daniel 11:40, we enter the time of the end that begins after the Great Tribulation of the Middle Ages, verse 37. In other words, that time of the end begins with the French Revolution in 1798, when a French general took from Pope Pius VI the supposed ring of Peter and declared that from that moment onwards, no authority would emanate from the papal see. Let us read the words of the prophet in Daniel 11:40. But in the time of the end, the king of the south shall lock horns with him, and the king of the north shall raise up a storm against him with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the lands and shall overflow and pass over. The Hebrew word employed to depict the confrontation is the same word employed to portray two animals which charge each other with their horns. Who are the king of the north and the king of the south in the time of the end? In Daniel's time, there was a conflict between the king of the north and the king of the south. According to Jeremiah 46:10, the king of the north was a reference to Babylon. In the land of the north by the river Euphrates. The king of the south, on the other hand, was a reference to Egypt. Egypt is a beautiful heifer, but a gadfly is coming against her from the north, Jeremiah 46:20. And Daniel himself says that at the time of the end, Egypt will not escape from the invasion of the king of the north, namely Babylon, Daniel 11:43. That battle takes place in the time of the end, and Daniel projects it to that time, as we can see in the explicit statements of the book of Revelation. As a matter of fact, the book of Revelation refers to Rome under the term Babylon, the city of the seven hills or mountains, Revelation 17:9. More definitely to the Roman Catholic Church, which is represented as a woman, a symbol of a church that prostitutes herself with the kings of the earth. The king of the south appears at the conclusion of the 1260 years in 1798, which in John's terms it is figuratively called Sodom and Egypt, Revelation 11 verses 7 and 8. It has to do with the atheist or secular powers that rise from the French Revolution against clerical or religious powers, marking a system of separation in government between church and state. So, from verse 40 in Daniel 11, we see the struggle between the secular powers and the religious powers that characterize modern history from 1798 to the present day. Let us read the following statements of Ellen G. White. Of all nations presented in Bible history, Egypt most boldly denied the existence of the living God and resisted his commands. No monarch ever ventured upon more open and high-handed rebellion against the authority of heaven than did the king of Egypt. When the message was brought him by Moses in the name of the Lord, Pharaoh proudly answered, "Who is Jehovah, that I should hearken unto his voice to let Israel go? I know not Jehovah, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." Exodus 5:2. This is atheism, and the nation represented by Egypt would give voice to a similar denial of the claims of the living God and would manifest a like spirit of unbelief and defiance. The corruption of Sodom in breaking the law of God was especially manifested in licentiousness. And this sin was also to be a preeminent characteristic of the nation that should fulfill the specifications of the scriptures. She wrote this in the book Great Controversy in page 269. This world, which adopted at different times different economic names such as capitalism and communism, may be also seen in the current left and right political confrontations. We know who will win in that penultimate battle of the world, as the winner of that battle must face the King of Kings and Lord of Lords in the last great battle, Armageddon. The king of the north is Babylon, and it is today manifested in the religious authorities which are uniting to impose the decrees that they have in common. Thus, it is being particularly promoted in the imposition of a sacred spurious day as a green day, with the claim that it is necessary to save the planet, what they call our common home, from environmental pollution and global warming. Daniel 11:43. He will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt. John will term this with other words in Revelation 13:17, in reference to the economic control that will be implemented over the whole world. This economic boycott is already being applied by the United States and Europe to countries that do not adopt Western democratic government principles. Soon, that discrimination will go further and become not racial, but religious, against all who keep God's commandments. Daniel 11:41 says that the king of the north, Babylon, will also invade the beautiful land, where in all times was the temple of God. But after Christ, what comes for God and his people is not Israel according to the flesh, but the Israel of God, Galatians 6 verse 15. Spiritual Israel, the true church of Christ. Many Protestant and evangelical churches would fall in the final crisis, which will be led by the papacy. But Daniel continues saying, "But Edom, Moab, and the main part of the Ammonites will escape from his hand." These tribes were related to ancient Israel and were their neighbors in Palestine. Some Old Testament prophecies ensure that the remnant of these peoples will be saved. In their final representation at the time of the end, we can see that some Christian churches will be converted to the last remnant and escape the overwhelming power of the religious coalition of Babylon. It is important to note that the evangelical churches are related to the last faithful remnant of God because they reject the worship of the Pope and the saints and virgins of Rome, as well as the sacrifice of the Mass. the atrial confession, the justification by works on which the Roman Catholic Church is founded. Some of these churches will join the last remnant, the Adventist Church, as is already happening today in some places, and will escape the dominion of the Babylonian final apostasy to be saved at the second coming of Christ. Others will fall in the Roman trap. Let us remember that in the book of Revelation, the final symbolic Israel is not the carnal Jews, nor all Christianity, but only a remnant, Revelation 12:17, represented by 144,000 spiritual warriors, by the last faithful generation who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus, Revelation 14, verse 1 and 12. See also Revelation 12:17. Daniel 11:44. But reports from the east and the north will alarm him, and he will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. Isn't this what John repeats in Revelation 13:15, when he says that already in the very end, when a psychotic chaos will cover the earth, a decree will be issued to kill all who do not worship the Antichrist, that is, to anyone who does not submit to a mark that will be imposed on the forehead or in the hand, which honors the Roman papacy. The news from the east corresponds to the three angels' messages who announced the fall of Babylon and warn of the final place that will fall upon the world. Revelation 14, verses 6 to 12. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling for demons and a haunt for every impure spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable animal. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries. Revelation 14:8 and Revelation 18, verses 2 and 3. Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. Revelation 18, verses 4 and 5. The king of the east who delivered the people of Israel from ancient Babylon was Cyrus, the Persian king, who allowed the Jews to return to the promised land. In a symbolic apocalyptic depiction, that king is Christ, who will come from the east like the lightning which is visible even in the west, to bring his people to the heavenly Zion. Cyrus, the king of the east, diverted the waters of the river Euphrates so that the soldiers could pass under the gates of the city of Babylon and seize it. In the book of Revelation, the symbolic kings of the east who appear in the sixth plague and who dry up the waters of Babylon that support it, multitudes, nations, peoples, and tongues, are Jesus and his angels. Revelation 16, verses 12 to 16. They come to save his oppressed people. Why does this news come not only from the east, but also from the north? Because the north is also a biblical reference to heaven, and the three angelic messages of Revelation 14 come from heaven, verse 6. What does the king of the north tries to do at that moment? Daniel 11:45 tells us what will happen. He will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. The Babylonian religious coalition led by the papacy will finally seek to establish herself where the devil always wanted to establish himself, on the mountain that God chose to dwell with his people and to reveal his version of the great conflict between Christ and Satan. That mountain is not in literal Palestine today. It is in heaven, where the New Jerusalem is found, and Christ intercedes for his people in the temple of God. Let us review this last section of Daniel 11. The king of the north is Babylon, which in the book of Revelation is applied to Rome, more definitely to the Roman papacy. The king of the south is Egypt, which in the book of Revelation is projected symbolically to atheist or secular governments at the time of the end after 1798. The winner of that conflict is, in the end, the Roman papacy, which seeks to impose itself upon the Israel of God, the last remnant who keeps the commandments of God and has the spirit of prophecy. But that Babylonian earthly prince will fail, because this time the Lord will say, enough. He will rise in his wrath to save his people and to destroy those who destroy the earth. The book of Revelation is clear in saying that in the end the wrath of God is pitted against the wrath of the nations. Revelation 11:18 declares, "The nations are angry, and your wrath has come." The devil inspires the wrath of the nations led by the king of the north to destroy the faithful remnant of spiritual Israel. Revelation 12:17. And God pours out his wrath by coming against them in the seven last plagues. Revelation 6:17 and 18, Revelation 15, and Revelation 16. Thus do all prophetic series end, with the destruction of the oppressive empire of Rome, which in its final phase unites politics with religion in the person of the Pope. Let's look at that tragic end in the following slides. But the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Daniel 7:26. He will be destroyed but not by human power. Daniel 8:25. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. Daniel 11:45. Whom the Lord Jesus will overthrow with the breath of his mouth and destroy by the splendor of his coming. 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 8. The great city of Babylon will be cast down, never to be seen again. Revelation 18, verse 21. The beast was captured and thrown alive into the fiery lake of burning sulfur. Revelation 19, verse 20. In what solemn moments we are living, and so many people don't know it. How many of us are living as if nothing happened without noticing how close we are, so that the dark cloud which is already looming over the horizon will reach us like a terrible tempest? What matters most in this story? What is depicted in the next chapter. Michael will rise up to save his people, all whose names are written in the book of life. Get ready, my friend, because that day is coming. So be it. Amen.